"You're finished here, Ben." That's what Chase Montgomery declared as he slid a thick, overstuffed manila envelope across the polished conference table, his voice calm and practiced, like he was dealing out the final card in a poker game I'd already lost. Effective immediately. I'm Ben Crawford, 52 years old, and as of this moment, I was no longer employed by the company I had helped haul out of obscurity, back when we were nothing more than an afterthought, crammed into 2 dingy rooms above a pizza joint that reeked of burnt cheese and desperation. I watched the envelope land on the gleaming mahogany, the sound oddly muted, a soft, dull thud that reverberated louder in my chest than Chase's carefully measured words ever could. I didn't reach for it, didn't even look at it. I just sat in that over-designed, over-air-conditioned room, blinking in the harsh Monday morning sunlight pouring through those floor-to-ceiling windows. Windows that cost more than the first car I ever bought. I remembered helping Howard Montgomery, Chase's father, the company's founder, and the only real boss we'd ever had, pick out those very windows 8 years ago when my opinion actually meant something. When people still believed that loyalty and sweat equity counted for more than buzzwords and quarterly projections. "Generous severance package," Chase droned on, adjusting his designer tie with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Full benefits through the end of the year," he added, as if reading from a list of boxes to be checked. "Dad wanted to make sure you were looked after." Dad, not Howard, not Mr. Montgomery, just Dad, uttered with the casual entitlement of someone who's never known anything but safety nets and legacy. As though this was just a family affair, one big happy clan passing the baton, rather than a sprawling public company processing billions in compliance data every quarter. Maybe in its own warped way, it really was a family business, just not the kind that ever included me. At the far end of the table, Taylor Montgomery sat upright, spine straight as a ruler, nodding in time to her brother's script. She looked impossibly young, 29 and barely out of the latest startup accelerator, radiating that bulletproof confidence you only see in people who have never been told no in their lives. Her tablet was balanced on her lap, stylus poised and ready, like she was already drafting her next LinkedIn post about operational streamlining and disruptive change. "It's really about modernization," she announced, not bothering to look up. "We're pivoting to agile methodologies and cloud-native architectures. Your legacy systems approach doesn't fit with our digital transformation roadmap anymore." Legacy systems. That's what they call the Crawford Integration Protocol now. The same system that, for nearly a decade, quietly and reliably handled compliance data for 847 banks across North America. The architecture I spent 3 years building from scratch, then 2 more perfecting, piece by painstaking piece, while Chase was off studying abroad and Taylor was collecting certificates in social media influence or whatever. That legacy system is the reason Meridian didn't get annihilated by federal fines 6 times. It's the reason this company has a reputation at all. The reason those floor-to-ceiling windows even exist. I'd spent more nights, weekends, and holidays hunched over lines of code than I care to admit. Always answering the 2 a.m. calls, always the first one in and the last one out. While the Montgomery kids were busy rehearsing their TED Talk personas, I picked up my old coffee mug, the one with the faded Meridian logo from the days we were still Montgomery and Associates. Back then, clients meant more than exit strategies. The coffee inside was cold, as stale and bitter as the morning. It must have been sitting there for over an hour, ever since the presentation where they talked about right-sizing our human capital allocation. That's corporate speak for, "We're firing you," if you don't speak boardroom. "So when do you want me gone?" I asked, voice flat. Chase looked at me like I'd missed a cue, as if he expected me to protest, to plead my case, to mention my mortgage or the kids' tuition, maybe to wax poetic about loyalty and the 24 years I'd poured into this place. But I've been in the trenches of corporate life longer than either of them has known how to spell SQL. Once the decision's been made, it's done. Argue, and you just look desperate, feeding them stories to repeat at networking events, proof that they were tough enough to make the hard calls. "Today would be ideal," Chase said, feigning a regret he clearly didn't feel. "We've already transitioned your access credentials to the integration team." The integration team. 3 junior devs barely out of a coding boot camp. Kids who still thought API stood for a pretty interface. Their collective experience wouldn't fill a single summer internship, but they were young, cheap, and spoke fluent disruption. That's what the investors wanted. Fresh faces who knew all the buzzwords, who could pitch machine learning and microservices, even if they couldn't explain a race condition to save their lives. The future apparently was in good hands. I tried to train them, Tried to pass on what little of my knowledge could be squeezed into half-hour meetings and shared drive folders. I started 6 months ago, right after Howard Sr. began muttering about succession planning and knowledge transfer. But how do you teach 2 decades of regulatory chaos, of system failures and 2 a.m. fire drills, of 1,000 hard-won lessons? How do you explain to someone who's never been truly scared of losing a client, someone who thinks debugging means copy-pasting error messages into Stack Overflow, what it means to be responsible for the lifeblood of a company? There's no wiki for that, no onboarding module, just gray hair and a deep unspoken sense of duty. I stood up, pushed my chair back, slow and deliberate.
No handshakes.
No speeches, no last-minute appeals to reason or gratitude. Just me, my dignity, and 24 years of sweat and late nights and quiet victories, leaving Meridian Systems for what they assumed would be the last time. Eddie, the security guard, one of the few faces left from the old days, a guy I'd shared more late-night conversations and bad coffee with than most of my so-called colleagues, wouldn't even meet my eyes as he escorted me out. He'd been here almost as long as I had. Back when we were 12 people, when you knew everyone's birthday and the whole company could fit around a single conference table. Now we were 340 strong in 4 offices, and Eddie was just another uniform, following protocols drafted by some distant HR manager who'd never once missed a holiday for a system outage. HR had already boxed up my desk. Personal items only. No file folders, no code samples, just the battered photo frame of my kids at the company picnic. A couple of faded Post-its with reminders only I'd understand. My old Mont Blanc pen, an anniversary gift from Howard Sr. Back when anniversaries meant something. I scanned the box, thinking about everything that wasn't in it. 2 decades of ideas, instincts, and relationships. All the invisible threads that held this place together. They hadn't even bothered to ask me to write a transition memo. They didn't know what they didn't know. And by the time they figured it out, I'd be long gone. Just another ghost in the machine they were so eager to upgrade. I paused at the door, listening to the low hum of voices and the faint tap of Taylor's stylus on glass. The company would move on, I knew. That's what companies do. But somewhere down the line, when the shiny new system started to creak and the integration team ran out of Stack Overflow answers, maybe someone would remember the guy who kept the lights on. Quietly. Without fanfare for 24 years. Or maybe not. Maybe I'd just be another name on a severance envelope, lost in the shuffle of corporate progress. Either way, I walked out with my head held high, the sunlight harsh on my face and the future unwritten. They said they'd kept the technical manuals. The system documentation I painstakingly wrote late into the night, the network diagrams I'd sketched on notepads during that first wild scramble to rebuild the architecture in 2018. Supposedly, they'd also stored the 3 high-res monitors I paid for myself, because the grainy displays the company provided left me with splitting headaches after 12-hour debugging marathons. 24 years of my life distilled into a single cardboard box, a faded coffee mug, a drooping desk plant I'd forgotten to water for weeks, and a photo of my kids, both beaming in their graduation gowns, arms around each other. It all felt both too much and not enough to represent the decades I'd poured into that place. I drove home through silent streets to the empty house I bought 5 years back, right after the divorce. When the lawyers and accountants finished tallying and dividing, I was left with half the money and twice the uncertainty. Starting over at 47, the house echoed with every step, the emptiness more pronounced now that I had nowhere to be at sunrise. The back deck was still warped and splintered, a project I'd always intended to tackle but never did. Work had always come first. There was always another crisis, another system fire to put out. Now I had nothing but time, and the problems I'd once solved seemed to have evaporated along with my badge access. I poured a couple fingers of bourbon into a glass, the ritual oddly comforting, and settled in at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop, not to rage post on social media or write a scathing email to HR, but to do what felt natural: investigate, analyze, problem solve. This time, though, the problem was me. Scrolling through old directories, I wasn't looking for a technical loophole or ammunition for a wrongful termination suit. Being an at-will employee in a right-to-work state meant I had no recourse. I wasn't interested in public revenge, or in letting my professional obituary be written by a bored HR rep. I hadn't reached that level of surrender. What I was searching for was a memory, something I'd signed in the haze of March 2015 when the company went through a complex shuffle for tax purposes. Howard Sr., ever the cautious patriarch, had grown paranoid after reading about a compliance software firm in California that had been blindsided by a lawsuit that nearly wiped them out. So, on his orders, we split our IP assets into various shell companies. It was a textbook move for a business of our size, but the paperwork had been dense, the signatures hurried. I remembered the late hour. The folder named Tax Shield March 2015, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. I found it buried deep in my digital files, surrounded by years of expense reports and glowing performance reviews I'd kept like talismans. The document's title was as dry as the bourbon in my glass. Intellectual Property Transfer and Licensing Agreement. Crawford Integration Protocol, March 15, 2015. 23 pages, most of which I'd barely skimmed. Back then, I trusted Howard Sr., and my own lawyer was draining my bank account for every minute he spent on my divorce. I scrolled, eyes glazing over at the familiar legal boilerplate. Indemnification, limitation of liability, technical definitions of the protocol I'd birthed from nothing. But then on page 9 I stopped. There, sandwiched unassumingly between maintenance obligations and update rights, was section 12.7a. If the primary architect and license originator is terminated from Meridian Systems, Inc. without documented cause before March 15, 2025, all intellectual property rights, licenses, and derivative work permissions snap back to Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC, effective immediately on termination. I read it again, and again. The words didn't change, though my understanding of them deepened with each pass. The clause was airtight, written in the kind of legalese that bored most people but now struck me as poetic justice. A prickle of adrenaline ran through me. I toggled over to the Delaware Secretary of State's website, heart thudding. There it was. Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC, formed March 12, 2015. Sole member, Benjamin Crawford. Active status, filing fees paid up. I hadn't thought about that LLC in years. It existed as a line on my tax returns and an occasional envelope from the state, but nothing more. My glass was empty. I poured another, hands shaking slightly, and dialed Mike Hartley, my lawyer. He'd seen me through the mess of my divorce and had handled the LLC paperwork back when all this began. Mike was the rare attorney who actually talked like a human being, and I knew he kept every scrap of paper in a meticulous file system that predated the cloud. "Ben?" His voice was thick with sleep. "It's almost midnight. Everything all right? Mike, I need you to dig up the old IP transfer agreement with Meridian. Section 12.7a. I heard the rustle of files. Mike's office always smelled like paper and old coffee. Okay, got it. The reversion clause. What's going on? They fired me today. No explanation. Corporate restructuring. He went silent, the magnitude of my words settling in. Ben, do you realize what this means? I have a hunch, but I need you to lay it out. You own the Crawford Protocol as of today. Meridian has no legal right to license, sell, or even use it without your explicit approval. Every piece of revenue that relies on that technology, every client contract, they're all dependent on IP that's now yours again. They just handed you the keys to the kingdom. I stared out the window, watching the blue flicker of my neighbor's TV across the yard. Somewhere in there, a family was probably gathered on the couch, arguing about what to watch, completely oblivious to the tectonic shift happening in my life. I'd spent years building something irreplaceable, and now, by a twist of fate and a forgotten clause, I found myself holding the crown jewels of a company about to be sold for nearly $500 million. Mike, there's another wrinkle. Meridian is in the final stages of a sale to Atlantic Tech Solutions. Deal's supposed to close next week. There was a low whistle at the other end. Ben, are you telling me they're about to sell a company whose core asset they don't actually own? Do they even know about this clause? I don't think so. I'd forgotten about it until tonight. Mike's silence stretched out, heavy with calculation. I could almost hear him working through the scenarios, the leverage, the potential windfall. In that moment, the years of late nights and missed birthdays, the sacrifices and the heartbreak, suddenly felt like the prelude to something bigger. The rules had changed, and for the first time in a long while I was holding all the cards. Here's how we'll proceed. I'll put together a formal notice, not antagonistic. Just a straightforward declaration that, effective immediately, Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC is the rightful owner and licensor of the integration protocol. The tone will be measured but unmistakably clear. Ownership, licensing, and control rest with us. We'll send it off to their legal department, making sure Atlantic Tech's counsel is copied on every word. Then the ball's in their court. We'll see just how much this deal matters to them. how much they're willing to push past the surface to get what they want. That night, I slept better than I had in months. It wasn't relief. Getting fired never feels good, especially after years spent building something from the ground up. But there was a strange comfort in finally having some agency. For too long, I'd been stuck in a cycle of reacting, putting out fires, responding to impossible demands, never steering the ship. Now, for the first time in a while, I had something to do, a lever to pull. The next morning, for once, felt almost like any other. I brewed coffee, thumbed through the Wall Street Journal, and sat quietly, anticipation humming beneath the ordinary sounds of my house. I waited, knowing the phone would ring sooner or later. It didn't take long. At 10:15 sharp, my phone vibrated against the kitchen table. "Ben, it's Nathan Pierce." I knew the voice instantly. Nathan had been one of my most promising junior devs at Meridian, the kind of guy who didn't just follow instructions but questioned them, always looking for the logic behind every decision. He'd left for Atlantic Tech 3 years ago, chasing a bigger title and broader horizons. Now, he was heading up their technical integration, responsible for making sure a $400 million investment didn't implode the minute someone tried to deploy it. "Nathan, good to hear from you." "Been a while." "Yeah, it has. Listen, I heard about what happened yesterday. That's rough. You all right?" "Getting there." "What's going on?" He hesitated. There was a tension in his voice, a careful pause like he was weighing every word. I recognized the tone. He was about to step into territory he wasn't sure he should even mention. "Look, I probably shouldn't be calling, but we're deep diving into the Crawford Protocol as part of due diligence and, well, things aren't lining up. The documentation points to implementation choices that don't match what we're hearing from their people." I wasn't shocked. The integration team at Crawford was green. Smart, maybe, but green. They hadn't been there for the foundational decisions, the late nights, the endless revisions. Most of what they knew was inherited secondhand, passed down like an oral history. Incomplete, occasionally embellished, and full of gaps. The real architecture, the why behind every subsystem, every fork in the code base, was a black box to them. "What exactly isn't lining up?" I asked. "For one thing, their lead developer claims the transaction validation engine is powered by machine learning." "That can't be right, can it? I remember you explaining that it was all rule-based, expert systems, decision trees, deterministic stuff." I had to bite back a laugh. Tommy Davis, their lead dev, was fresh out of grad school and convinced that every problem could be solved with neural networks and a flashy TensorFlow pipeline. He'd probably never had to answer to a regulator on a compliance audit in his life. "Nathan, machine learning is great for some things, but not for real-time compliance validation. If you want consistency and legal defensibility, you can't afford probabilistic ambiguity. Compliance isn't about finding patterns. It's about meeting explicit, ever-shifting requirements. You need logic that's traceable, explainable, and above all, reliable. Machine learning might find a pattern, but it won't stand up in court when a regulator asks why a transaction was flagged or approved." He was quiet, the sound of keys clacking in the background. I could picture him sitting in a glass-walled conference room, laptop open, a half-empty coffee cup to his left, anxiety etched across his face. "Ben, can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure, shoot. Who actually owns the Crawford Protocol?" I took a deliberate sip of coffee, watching a cardinal hop onto the porch railing. The same spot as yesterday, a splash of red against the gray wood. "That's a good question, Nathan. Might want your legal team to take a close look at the licensing agreements, especially anything dated around March 2015. Don't skip the fine print." The silence stretched. 10 seconds, maybe more. I could sense the gears turning on his end, the sudden realization of what he might be staring at. "Are you implying what I think you're implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm saying your legal team should be thorough. That's what you pay them for." "If you're right, this deal could be in real jeopardy. It doesn't have to be, but if the facts are what I think they are, then yeah, there's going to need to be some renegotiation." After I hung up, I let the phone sit in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had just shifted. I made another pot of coffee and stepped out onto the deck. The boards creaked beneath my feet, warped by years of neglect. The railings were splintering, paint peeling, but for the first time in a long while, I saw them for what they were, problems I could actually solve if I put in the time. Work had always been all-consuming. Every fire, every crisis, every impossible deadline. I'd let everything else slide, convinced that someday I'd get around to fixing what was right in front of me. Maybe now was the time. By 2 in the afternoon, word got around that Atlantic Tech's lawyers had finally read Section 12.7a, the obscure clause buried deep in the contract, the one I'd insisted on during those marathon negotiations years ago. By 3, they'd confirmed through Delaware's registry that Crawford Technical Holdings still existed, still held the patents, still owned every critical line of code. By 4, Atlantic's lead counsel was on a call with Meridian's lawyers, rattling off questions about IP ownership, transfer of rights, indemnifications, and whether due diligence had been performed in good faith. The dominoes were falling, one after another, and for the first time in years I felt like I wasn't just watching. This time, I'd actually given them a push. I wasn't on that call. Nathan caught me up after the fact. He'd heard the story straight from his boss, who'd been in the room and watched, firsthand, as Howard Montgomery Sr. turned 3 distinct shades of red. It happened while his son Chase fumbled through a rationale for why firing the system architect 5 days before closing was, in hindsight, perhaps not the shrewdest move Meridian Systems could have made. The room apparently went from tense to funereal in moments. The fallout was immediate and unambiguous. An emergency board meeting, called for 9 a.m. sharp the next morning, with every key player expected to attend, and no one under any illusions about what was at stake. My part in the drama began at 6:30 a.m., when my phone jangled me awake. The caller ID flashed Patricia Wells, Atlantic Tech's lead counsel, and a woman whose reputation for unflappable surgical efficiency preceded her. Her voice when she spoke was clipped and steely, the kind you hear from professionals who spend their careers cleaning up high-priced disasters, never surprised, always a step ahead of the next fire. "Mr. Crawford," she said, wasting no time on pleasantries, "I think we need to talk." "I figured you might," I replied, already bracing myself for the day ahead. "Would you be available to join a conference call at 10? Apparently, there were questions, serious questions, about the technical architecture of the system at the center of the acquisition deal. Questions, it seemed, that only I could answer. I told her I was available, but pointedly reminded her I no longer worked for Meridian Systems. "Yes, we're aware of that," she replied, her tone never wavering. "That's precisely why we need to speak with you." At 9:55, I dialed into the conference bridge. On the line were 12 people representing both Atlantic Tech and Meridian, board members, lawyers, and a smattering of executives, all sounding more alert than you'd expect for that hour. Howard Sr. logged in looking like a man whose foundations had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Every word he spoke heavy with the knowledge that he was on the brink of disaster. He introduced everyone carefully, conspicuously omitting any mention of his son or daughter, both absent, both presumably wishing they were anyplace else. Patricia Wells ran the meeting with the calm assurance of someone who's brokered deals worth more than most people make in a lifetime, and who's seen enough boardroom battles to know when a storm is about to break. "Mr. Crawford," she began, "can you confirm you're the sole owner of Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC? "I can," I answered, clear and steady. "And that this entity retains the licensing rights to the integration protocol, the primary asset in our proposed acquisition, per section 12.7a of the March 2015 IP transfer agreement?" "Yes," I confirmed. "My employment was terminated without documented cause, so the reversion clause was triggered." For a moment, silence reigned. Not the comfortable sort, but the kind that descends when tens of millions, hundreds of millions are on the line, and a single misstep could unravel years of work. I could hear furious typing in the background, likely a Meridian attorney drafting the opening salvo of a lawsuit should things go south. Howard Sr. cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Ben, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The IP assignment was always meant to be temporary, for tax purposes. You know that." "I do, Howard, but the agreement was clear. The assignment came with reversion clauses, one of which was triggered Monday, the moment your son fired me without cause." "It's all in the paperwork," a new voice broke in, one I didn't recognize, almost certainly one of Meridian's outside counsel, billing $800 an hour to sound indignant. "This is absurd. The system was developed using company resources, on company time with company equipment. There's no question the IP should be Meridian's." "Actually," I said, already pulling up a folder on my laptop that I'd prepared for exactly this eventuality, "I have detailed documentation showing that 73% of the core development took place on my personal equipment, over weekends and evenings, using methodologies I'd developed prior to ever joining Montgomery and Associates. I kept logs, emails, and every major communication. I even have correspondence from Howard Sr. confirming that, for the tax optimization plan to withstand scrutiny, the IP transfer needed to be legally above board and show genuine separation. I'd spent hours the previous morning combing through old emails, expense reports, and version control logs. Years of being both naturally organized and slightly paranoid had paid off. I'd archived everything, time-stamped code commits from my home IP at 2 a.m. on Sundays, receipts for hardware I'd bought out of pocket, and detailed notes on design decisions made long before Meridian ever pitched the project to Atlantic Tech. I'd learned early that, in corporate politics, documentation wasn't just protection, it was power. Patricia Wells cut in, her tone measured. "Mr. Crawford, what would you need to resolve this?" I'd been mulling that question over for a day and a half, weighing options against consequences. I didn't want revenge, or to make an enemy of either company. Just a fair solution that respected the work I'd done and the relationships we'd built, without leaving collateral damage behind. Atlantic Tech can license the protocol directly from Crawford Technical Holdings, under standard licensing terms, I proposed. I'll oversee implementation and maintenance as technical consultant, ensuring a smooth handoff. Meridian can retain their consulting contract for non-technical services and client management. No need to disrupt existing relationships. "And the licensing fee?" Patricia asked, not missing a beat. "Same rate structure you were paying Meridian, except the contract runs directly through my company. No markup, no surprises, just transparency." Howard Sr. finally spoke again. He sounded exhausted, the bravado stripped away, like a man confronting the possibility that decades of partnership could be undone by a string of bad decisions. "Ben, this isn't how we do business. We've been partners for 24 years. "You're right, Howard," I replied, letting the truth hang in the air. Partners don't fire each other 5 days before closing a $400 million deal. Partners don't treat experience like an inconvenience, or replace senior architects with junior developers who think machine learning is a magic bullet for regulatory compliance. Partnership is built on trust, and trust has to go both ways. The line went quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. Thoughtful, maybe even hopeful. For the first time, I sensed that everyone on the call understood what was really at stake. Not just a deal or a piece of software, but the relationships and the reputations that would outlast any contract. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes what feels like the end of something is really just the start of a new chapter. One where you get to decide finally, on your own terms, what happens next. Somebody sucked in their breath, sharp and sudden, loud enough to slice right through the tense silence. I caught it instantly. Probably one of Meridian's lawyers realizing in real time that their clients had just managed to blurt out, for the record, that their own development team was in way over their heads. You could practically hear the gears turning as everyone on that call scrambled to assess just how much damage had been done. Patricia Wells, quick as ever, jumped in before the hole got any deeper. "Mr. Crawford, would you be willing to discuss specific terms with our team, off this call?" I didn't hesitate, just said yes. She seized the opening. "Excellent. Howard, I think Meridian needs to talk things over internally. We'll reconvene once everyone's reviewed their options." The call fizzled out with a chorus of fake friendly goodbyes, each one more transparent than the last. No one was fooling anyone. We all knew the game. We'd just seen a major piece fall off the board. I hung up, feeling the leftover adrenaline from the call vibrating in my chest. I made myself a sandwich, the kind with too much mustard, and took it out to the deck. Physical labor, hammering in a few warped planks, tightening loose bolts, did wonders for clearing my mind after that kind of boardroom bloodletting. Out there, under the open sky, the mess of corporate politics felt distant, almost manageable. I knew this was just round one in what would probably be a long, bruising negotiation. The opening salvos had been fired, and the real maneuvering was only beginning. At 4:30, Nathan called, his voice low and urgent. "You know Chase and Taylor are both gone, right?" "Gone how?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Howard Sr. called an all-hands meeting at 3. Said they were taking extended leave to pursue other opportunities and focus on personal development. The corporate euphemisms were almost insulting in their transparency. Translation: they'd been shown the door. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant, just weary. In business, you learn that the best revenge isn't some dramatic showdown or clever scheme. It's just doing your work better than the people trying to push you out, letting competence and consistency do the talking. Karma isn't magic or fate. It's just the inevitable consequence of bad decisions catching up to the people who made them. How's the mood over there? I asked, imagining the chaos on the other end. Confused, Nathan replied. Half the dev team's worried about layoffs, the other half is panicking about the Atlantic Tech integration, if it even happens now. Everyone's asking who's going to handle the Crawford Protocol, and the ugly truth is, you're the only one who actually understands it in depth. What about Tommy Davis? Wasn't he supposed to step up as lead architect? I pictured Tommy, always eager but never quite up to the mark. Nathan gave a short, humorless laugh. Tommy spent yesterday trying to walk Atlantic Tech's compliance team through our machine learning protocols. Patricia Wells had their compliance officer on the call. Guy's a legend, 2 decades deep in financial regulation. Tommy was floundering, mixing metaphors about unicorns and tax law. It was embarrassing. That night, as dusk settled over the backyard, I grilled a steak and dialed my ex, Janet. We'd managed to stay amicable after the divorce, partly for the kids, but also because she genuinely understood the world I inhabited. She'd managed software projects before getting her MBA, so I didn't have to translate every detail of my day for her. I laid out the latest developments. Janet listened, then summed it up in her blunt, always insightful style. So let me get this straight, she said. They fired you, and now you own the technology they're desperate to license. That's the gist of it, I admitted. She snorted. Ben, that's either genius-level planning or the most expensive screw-up in that company's history. I vote for expensive screw-up. I never planned it this way. She laughed, the sound warm but a little incredulous. But you're not complaining, are you? Not a bit. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Those kids needed to see what experience is actually worth. If they ask you for help, you ought to charge them double. The next morning, just as the sun was burning off the last of the dew, a courier in a crisp suit arrived at my door. He asked for 2 forms of ID, security theater, but I appreciated the gesture, and handed over a heavy envelope. Inside was a licensing agreement between Crawford Technical Holdings and Atlantic Tech, along with a consulting contract that made my old salary look like tip money. The deal itself was elegantly simple. Atlantic Tech would license the Crawford Protocol directly from my company for the same $400 million they'd intended to pay Meridian, minus Meridian's cut for client services and integration. I would take home 60% of the licensing revenue, while Meridian kept 40% for their sales and ongoing client relationships. More importantly, I'd be named Senior Technical Advisor for the entire integration, with the final say on any and all changes to the core system. My expertise, the very thing they'd tried to sideline, was now officially indispensable. I read the contract twice just to be sure. Then I called Mike Hartley, my lawyer, to comb through the legal language and make sure there weren't any traps hidden in the fine print. Once I was satisfied, I signed at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, the morning news murmuring in the background. No boardroom drama, no champagne toasts or smug speeches about corporate synergy. Just me, a pen, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing 24 years of stubborn, often thankless work finally recognized. That afternoon, Howard Sr. called. The fatigue in his voice was unmistakable. A weight that went deeper than business. The heaviness of a father watching years of effort nearly undone by his own children's hubris. Ben, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Howard. You made a business call. So did I. That's how this works. He hesitated, searching for the right words. My kids thought they could run this company better than the people who built it. They saw your experience as a liability, not an asset. I could hear the regret, the frustration. Just a man who'd spent his life building something, only to watch it nearly unravel at the hands of those he trusted most. Your kids are smart, Howard, I said, meaning it. But sometimes smart isn't enough. Sometimes you need to respect the work it took to get here, not just the ideas that sound good in a meeting. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that finally clear the air. This was more than just a deal. It was a reckoning and maybe the beginning of something better. They just need to understand that intellect isn't a substitute for experience, and that stirring things up for the sake of appearances hardly qualifies as real innovation. There's a difference between fresh thinking and reckless disruption, but too many smart young hires can't see it. Are you thinking about coming back? Not to your old job, more like stepping in as a senior advisor. You could help us rebuild the technical team from the ground up. Make sure we get it right this time instead of just repeating the same mistakes with new faces. I didn't need long to think about it. 3 seconds maybe. The thought of enduring endless meetings about agile transformation, digital disruption, or whatever new management trend was making the rounds, made my jaw tense. The memory of hours spent in conference rooms arguing about frameworks and KPIs, while nothing meaningful changed, was still too fresh. "I'll consult on specific projects through my own company," I said, "but I'm finished with office politics and those recursive meetings about meetings. I've got my own business to run now, a business I can shape according to what I know actually works, not the latest buzzwords." "All right, can't blame you for that. But what about the integration team? Tommy Davis is asking if he should start looking for a new gig. He says the morale's shaky, everyone's nervous. Tommy's solid, always has been. He's sharp, but he needs to realize that machine learning isn't a hammer for every nail. Sometimes a reliable script and thorough documentation solve more problems than any neural net or fancy algorithm. Tell him to give me a call. I'll walk him through the compliance architecture, show him where the real risks are, and make sure he's ready when Atlantic Tech's auditors come knocking. He'll need that knowledge if he wants to stick around." 3 weeks later, the integration went live. No compliance violations, no system crashes, no late-night fire drills. Tommy, with some proper mentoring and the kind of documentation I always wished we'd had, handled the rollout with a confidence I hadn't seen before. I watched it all from my home office, checking dashboards and logs, ready to jump in if needed. But everything held. Atlantic Tech's team was thoroughly impressed. Their compliance officer sent over a bottle of small batch bourbon, along with a handwritten note saying it was the smoothest regulatory transition he'd ever witnessed. No small praise in our world. 6 months down the line, Crawford Technical Holdings has grown to 4 full-time employees and contracts with 6 different companies, each one looking for better, more resilient compliance systems. The Atlantic Tech project was such a success that they vouched for us with 2 of their partners, and suddenly our calendar was full. In the compliance software world, if you actually deliver what you promise, no excuses, no hand-waving, just solid results, your reputation travels fast. Chase Montgomery ended up at a blockchain startup in Austin, where his MBA credentials and obsession with disruption probably fit in better than they ever did with us. I hear he spends half his days on panels and podcasts talking about decentralization and future-proofing industries, whatever that means when you're still chasing your first round of serious funding. Taylor started a digital wellness consultancy, promising companies the key to maximizing social media synergy and employee engagement. Her LinkedIn is a never-ending stream of buzzwords, TED Talk clips, and posts about authentic leadership and pivoting toward purpose. I suspect she's happier now, at least even if she's still chasing trends. And me? I'm here in my home office at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, working on real-world problems for clients who value the hard-won lessons that come with decades in the trenches. No more meetings about right-sizing human capital. No more forced brainstorming. Sessions on how to leverage core competencies for sustainable growth vectors. I don't have to make PowerPoints about disrupting ourselves before the competition does. I spend my days designing systems that actually work, documenting them so someone else can keep them running, and charging rates that reflect the true value of what we provide. It's the work I always wanted to do. Substantial, impactful, and recognized for what it is. Funny how it took getting fired at 52 to finally put me in the position to do it. The Cardinals back on my porch again this morning, just like it has been nearly every day for the last 6 months. Still vibrant red, still fiercely territorial, still utterly indifferent to the endless parade of digital transformation initiatives or paradigm shifts happening in the business world. Watching it, I realize some things don't need to change, and some will change no matter what you do. The challenge is knowing which is which, and having the humility to accept both. After nearly 25 years in corporate America, getting fired was the best thing that could have happened to my career. Not because I hated my job or had a vendetta against Howard Sr., but because I'd let myself forget a few fundamental truths. I'd forgotten that long experience is more than just a list of problems fixed. It's a deep well of insight that can't be replaced by a clever new hire or the latest consulting report. I'd forgotten that institutional knowledge isn't the same thing as inertia. Sometimes it's wisdom hard-won, not resistance to change. I'd forgotten that being good at your job should count for more than a budget line item or a meets expectations annual review. Now I remember. And my clients remember too. Every time their systems pass regulatory audits without a hitch, every time the transactions process smoothly, every time they need someone who understands that compliance isn't about checking boxes but about knowing why the boxes exist and how the rules have evolved. Tommy Davis called yesterday. He wanted to thank me. He just got promoted to senior developer, and he's finally working on projects that challenge him, not just endlessly rebuilding systems that were already functional. The integration team has grown from 3 to 7, and for once, they're hiring experienced developers who know what a production outage feels like, not just fresh bootcamp grads thrown into the deep end. Meridian's doing fine. Their stock bounced back after the Atlantic tech deal, and they're doubling down on what they do best, building relationships and finding new business instead of chasing every shiny object in the tech landscape. Howard Sr.'s finally talking about retirement in earnest, and this time he's laying out a succession plan that's about actual talent, not just keeping the company and the family. The house is quieter now, no more early commutes, no conference calls echoing from the kitchen. It's a good quiet, though, the kind where you have space to think deeply, where you actually get meaningful work done instead of just running to keep up. I spend more time with my family, more time in my garden, and more time doing work I'm proud of. And as I watch the cardinal outside, I realize that sometimes losing your place in someone else's hierarchy is exactly what you need to build your own. There's a unique kind of stillness that settles in when you're finally free from the daily grind of office politics and the constant hum of anxiety about whether you'll survive the next round of layoffs. Without that background noise, the world feels quieter, but also somehow more alive. With the sudden gift of time, I finally tackled the deck out back, a project I'd put off for years. I spent the weekend sanding and staining, hands getting gritty and sore, mind blissfully unoccupied by deadlines or performance reviews. There's a clarity that comes from physical work, a satisfaction in seeing progress that doesn't require a meeting or a manager's sign-off. It's funny, the way losing something you thought you needed can shake you awake. I spent years chasing titles and performance bonuses, convincing myself that stress was just part of the package. But when the pink slip finally landed on my desk, I realized maybe I'd been scaling the wrong mountain all along. Getting fired felt like the ground dropping out beneath me, but once I caught my breath, I saw it for what it was, a chance to redraw the map. I started picking up consulting gigs, work where people called because they actually wanted my expertise, not just because I was on the payroll. Now, as I sit on the freshly stained deck, listening to a cardinal sing out before darting into the trees, I feel something I haven't felt in years, a sense of possibility. I pour myself another cup of coffee, open my laptop, and get down to business. This is work that matters. Work where the lines are clear and the value is obvious. There are no games to play, no politics to navigate, just problems to solve and clients to help. Tuesdays look a lot different at 52 than they did at 42, or even 32. But for the first time, I understand the difference between having a job and building a career. Sometimes hitting what feels like rock bottom is really just clearing away everything that didn't fit, leaving space for something more honest and fulfilling to grow.